Thanks. And thanks everyone for coming out. This is really cool because I haven't been doing a whole bunch of book events, and it's every time I come out to one, it's like, wow, people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both how my writing on this story came about, how the book came about, how Vaster Media came about, and how live blogging the Scooter Libby trial came about, and hopefully won't take too long and put anyone to sleep. And then afterwards, every time I do these things, people have lots of very interesting questions, so I want to leave some time for questions. As most of you, I think, know, the book came out of the blogging that I started doing at Next Hurrah. And I wrote the book and I started the blogging because, first of all, Judy Miller was about to go to jail. And everyone in the media was like, oh my God, Judy Miller's going to jail. And I was like, what if she's entirely complicit in protecting Scooter Libby? And at the beginning, people thought I was crazy. I got in a big fight with Meteor Blades, if anybody knows Meteor Blades, the blogger. And he kept saying, First Amendment, protect the journalists. And I was like, PR flack for the administration. You would not give the PR flack for Enron, First Amendment, reporter's privilege, so why should we give Judy Miller? And so I did this series on Judy Miller, and among all of the other things that I discovered about her reporting from Iraq, I also discovered that she insinuated, at the very least, that one of Ahmed Chalabi's big rivals was a CIA asset. And I thought that was pretty interesting that she did that a mere month and a half before the administration tried to launder the leak of Valerie Plame's identity to her. And when I kind of brought that out, people are like, well, yeah, maybe there is a continuity between what Judy Miller was doing in Iraq and what she was then, what they tried to make her do when she got back to the States. And then after I finished that series, this was right when the news came out that Karl Rove was the source for Matt Cooper. The day that it was reported that Karl Rove was also a source for Robert Novak, all of a sudden, I don't know if you guys remember this, all of a sudden there was this big campaign where all of the stories about Valerie Plame, you'd think they would be about Rove, but they weren't. They were about Ari Fleischer with the INR memo aboard Air Force Two, which was a completely bogus story and clearly invented by Rove. And the media bought it hook, line, and sinker. And I was like, this is crazy. So I kept writing. And that's how I got stuck on the story and really obsessed. And for those of you who followed along on Next Hurrah, you know that I became quite the obsessed person and read every single filing that came out of there. And but that was fun. And then not quite a year ago at DailyKos, so the first DailyKos convention, Jane Hampshire put together a panel with myself and her and Christy Harden-Smith and Joe Wilson and Larry Johnson, and we had about 10 people up on that stage or something like that. But over the course of the weekend, I was like, Jane, I think I've got a book. And Jane Hampshire, for those of you who don't know, was my publisher, also was the producer for Natural Born Killers and some other Hollywood movies. So as soon as you put a good idea in her head, you all of a sudden see things start to work, and she starts making things happen. So, before I knew it, she's like, okay, we're going to do a book. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that happened. And the idea behind Vaster Media came about because some of you may be familiar with Marcos Molitzis and Jerome Armstrong's Crashing the Gates, which was based on what they were doing in their blogs, but also based on a lot of what they were reporting on their blogs. And they did that really quickly. I mean, they kind of went and camped with the same editor who did my book, camped out with him in Montana and wrote it in very quick time and turned it into a book. And that's how that came about. Glenn Greenwald's How Would a Patriot Act, a lot of the same people involved, same process. We're going to go camp out, write a book in an obscenely short amount of time. And as a result, it's going to be a very, very timely book. And by the time I came around and said, I think I have a book, they're like, hey, we've got a business model. We can continue doing these obscene production schedules and have a book that way. So we actually did the outline for the book the first week of October 2006. I turned in the draft, or we turned in everything December 1. That's how long it took me to write the book. Luckily, that's the benefit. The idea is I had like 35,000 words written in blog posts just on the main series that I had done. So I was like, well, I just have to rewrite it for humans who don't read my blog, which actually took a lot of doing. They're like, people don't know any of these acronyms. I'm like, people don't know what the NIE is? They're like, no, start somewhere else, So we wrote it in 2 months, basically, and a lot of people went through some big hoops. But that's going to be, keep your eye out for Vaster Media, for Vaster Books, because I think the official launch is going to be this year's yearly Coast Convention, which will be in August. And I think I know of 4 people who are going to have titles coming out, all on some really interesting subjects, and all some of the best people in the blogosphere with some really interesting things to say. And the idea behind it is, first of all, to have timely books from people who are really engaging with both their subjects and their readers on a day-to-day basis, and to reach out to people who otherwise wouldn't read this stuff. I've got people who don't even have computers. They've come up and are like, I loved the book. I was like, wow, you would never have found my blog then, I guess. And then one of the other things, now I'll make my pitch for Drinking Liberally, but one of the other things that we're trying to do is to market it via different channels. Drinking Liberally is a great organization. You can get people to come out in large numbers and drink, and then they won't, notice that they just bought a book and had you sign it. So, I did a Drinking Liberally event in New York and a Drinking Liberally event in Washington, D.C., and they were both a lot of fun. So, and then the questions get interesting because, by the time I get done talking, you guys will be on your 3rd beer. And then the live blog started, and again, this was a lot largely due to Jane and to Christy from FireDog Lake. But about a year ago, we were kind of like, well, gosh, there's going to be a trial at the end of this, and we ought to be there. And Jane and Christy started 9 months before the trial trying to get a pass. And the courthouse was kind of like, fire what? And so then they went to Ariana and said, you're famous, you get us a pass. And so Ariana went to work. They're like, Ariana, do you run a blog? But we kept going, and then there was this kind of right-wing nutcase who was also working on getting bloggers passes. By the time I came, Marcos and Jane were in New York City one day about the day before the deadline for getting the passes was about to expire. Jane called me up. She's like, hey, Marcos says you should get a pass for DailyKos. I'm like, great, when's the deadline? She's like, 2 o'clock? She's like, so what you got to do is you got to invent some DailyKos stationery and send a letter from Marcos saying that you get a press pass. I was like, sure, why not? And I was just like, here's all of the things I've ever written on Plame. Trust me, I should be at this trial. Sure enough, I got in. I was like, whoo, that was, I suckered somebody. But there were people in the courthouse, we have reason to believe, certainly after the trial started, who were following along and loving it. But we think we had an advocate or two in the courthouse, too, so that helped, that people knew what the blogs were and knew that we weren't kind of crazy people. And so the way the live blogging worked was that there were, I think, altogether 6 bloggers six passes assigned to bloggers for the trial. We were the only bloggers that had a courtroom pass, which was kind of cool because, we had Christy Harden-Smith used to be a state prosecutor. We had Geraldine Merritt in on our pass. She was on the McVeigh defense team, so she knows her way around a courtroom. And Jane, of course, knows her way around drama as well as anybody. And then Pacha Kutek, who's also on FireDog Lake, is a shrink. So we had this great team to put them in the courtroom. I didn't make it into the courtroom until the very last day because I was like, no, I'm having so much fun at the computer. Don't let me go, So they had the actual courtroom where you couldn't bring in fun stuff like your computer, but then they had a closed circuit TV of what was going on in the courtroom itself. And you could see the attorneys, the judge, and the defense table. Couldn't see the jurors, so I could see everything but the jurors. But also, I was there with the mainstream media. So I was there as they were watching Kathy Martin say, oh, Dick Cheney says that when we go on Tim Russert's show, we control the message.